The Snake by Anita Yukani
and Sanjana Kulkarni.
February 1st, 1960. A group of black college students planned to sit in at a white lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to leave when they were denied service.
This refusal by a small number of blacks to accept the segregation in the society sparked a movement of black asserting their rights to whites and refusing to accept their inferior status.
News of lunch counter sit-ins in southern college towns became increasingly common after the first incident, and 2 months later at Shaw University in Raleigh, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or Sncc, was established. Throughout the early 1960s, racism and violent attitudes towards blacks increased in the South, and many blacks had to face the choice of standing up for their rights and dying a hero, or keeping quiet and living as inferiors. The Sncc was created for the people who chose to stand up, establishing its goal as using nonviolent protest to gain attention for black segregation, provoking social change and expansion of equality for blacks.
Although not all of their attempts were successful, the Sncc was responsible to a great extent for improving the black conditions in the South by securing voting rights and giving determination to many blacks to fight for equality.
Many of today's black leaders, such as former Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry, Congressman John Lewis, and NAACP Chairman Julian Bond, find their origins in the Sncc, and along with other students, they left a large impact on American history.
Nonviolence was a philosophy followed by the Sncc. In many cases, it was the key to their success. It created the impression that blacks were morally superior by responding to white violence with pacifism.
However, nonviolence became difficult as white violence became harsher, almost deadly.
The Sncc were determined to continue their struggle, knowing that the price could possibly be their lives. The event that the Sncc organized to achieve their goals brought great attention to the segregation issue and showed that their determination to rise to equality.
One of these events was the Freedom Rides, riding integrated buses through segregated areas with the goal of desegregating public transportation. The first occurred in 1961 after the Supreme Court decision to enforce segregation in travel.
The Freedom Riders were met with violence by whites and suffered jail time and beatings, leaving the riders wounded, but determined to continue their freedom rides.
They rode carrying their banners saying, "Black is not a vice, and segregation is not a virtue," to symbolize their goals. These rides, along with protests from other civil rights groups, eventually led to federal attention. The Supreme Court ruling proclaimed travel segregation unconstitutional, a huge step for blacks, and the Sncc was part of the victory. The Freedom Ballot was also a big step taken by the Sncc in causing change. The goal of this was voting rights in the South for African Americans, giving blacks influence in Southern politics.
Registering to vote was both extremely difficult and dangerous, as blacks who attempted to register often lost their jobs and their homes.
The Freedom Ballot, a statewide mock election, was an attempt to demonstrate black discrimination in politics in Mississippi in 1963, a state where racial discrimination was strong and black voting power was weak. Despite the attacks and arrests SNC members faced, the Freedom Ballot was a success. Nearly 80,000 blacks voted, 4 times the number registered to vote in the state of Mississippi, proving to whites that blacks would vote if given the chance. The determination of SNC members to work for voting rights caused them to be celebrated for their courage. The Freedom Ballot set the stage for Freedom Summer, a huge event organized by Bob Moses to overcome white racism in Mississippi. The goals of the program were to register white voters, open freedom schools, and organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to represent the ideas of the civil rights activists in politics and give Mississippi blacks a chance for equality. The huge movement for equality brought by Freedom Summer triggered enormous resistance from white extremists. By the end of the summer, 4 black Mississippians were killed. Volunteers and participants were beaten. More than 1,000 arrests were made, and nearly 70 churches, homes, and businesses were burned or bombed. The murder of 3 civil rights workers, 2 of them white, brought national attention to the suppression of black voting rights in the South. More wounds were suffered, but progress was made as the harsh reality of segregation became clearer in the eyes of the nation. The The Sncc also played a major role in the 1963 March on Washington, a peaceful march with speeches made by black activists to gain support for the civil rights movement, and the place where MLA gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. It was also where Sncc chairman John Lewis, a highly influential civil rights activist, gave a moving speech. While many speakers were gracious of the Kennedy administration for its civil rights legislation, Lewis was critical of the federal government's failure to protect civil rights workers in the South and its lack of support for the civil rights movement. He reflected this in his angry speech given that day. "We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of, for hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here. I want to know, which side is the federal government on?" John Lewis's words caused the government to temporarily agree to giving federal protection for Southern civil rights activists. In 1966, John Lewis was replaced by Stokely Carmichael as chairman of Sncc, representing a change in the Snccc's philosophy. Carmichael supported a separate black society, emphasizing black power and removing whites from important positions. Although the Sncc lost many supporters and influence in politics, it continued to cause civil rights activity and social change after 1977. Although not all of the Snccc's projects were a success, it represented how common black students took on a role in society, creating social change and equality not only for themselves but for future generations of blacks. The Sncc gave power to common black people. All decisions were not made by leaders, but by consensus of all members. By 1965, the Sncc had the largest staff of any civil rights movement in the South. It had organized nonviolent action against segregation in the public, enforced voter registration, labor unions, and independent political parties. It inspired activists and gave political power to blacks, creating federal attention and support for equality. The Sncc not only sought integration, it sought changes in American society itself. Although it alone did not cause these changes, it set the train of equality in motion, and provided inspiration and gained support for African American equality. The end. You have just seen a presentation by the Sncc Institute of American History.